Today we're going to be looking at demand. First thing that many people might associate with economics is supply and demand, so this is a crucial topic. And for those doing the AQA GCSE course, this is section 3.2.3.1 on this specification. So today we're going to be looking at the factors which determine demand, causes of changes in demand, and the demand curve. So before we delve into anything particular, let's try to define what demand is. So in everyday life, demand may mean wanting or requiring something. So I could say, I want to buy a car, and that could be translated as I'm demanding a car. However, economics has a slightly different notion of what demand is when we're looking at drawing diagrams for demand, and that's the notion of effective demand, which includes the ability to pay something. So let's say the car that I want is £20,000. I want 50 cars because that would be very nice to have 50 cars, but I can only really afford one, and therefore effective demand is only one car at that price. And so this is a really important difference. And you can extrapolate this to any scenarios. Let's take the example of pens. I may want 1,000,000 pens, but I can only afford one, or I can only afford 10. And so there's a difference between what the common perception of what demand is and effective demand, which we're concentrating on in economics. So now we know what demand is, let's look at the law of demand. So the law of demand states that ceteris paribus, as the price of a good rises, the quantity demanded of that good falls. Now you might not have come across this term ceteris paribus. Essentially what it means is all other things equal. So sometimes the real world is really complicated. There are many variables at play, and so ceteris paribus assumes all of those other variables to be constant. And so the only things that are changing are price and quantity. And this helps us get a simpler view of demand, and that helps us to make simpler models. And so let's try and take some data here and put that onto a demand curve to try and draw a demand curve from this consumer data. So there's some generic good here, and let's have a look at how the quantity demanded of that good changes as the price decreases. So let's start off by the price being £10, and as we see here, quantity demanded at £10 is 0. And as we go down to £8, £6, £4, £2, the quantity demanded of that good increases. And so we can look at this the other way as well. If we go from 0 to 4, 6, 8, 10, the quantity demanded of that good falls. And so this shows that the consumer data follows the law of demand. As the price of good rises, the quantity demanded of that good falls. As the price, and you can look at it either way. You could also say, as the price of a good falls, the quantity demanded of that good rises. And so this essentially shows that as you change the price of a good, and we'll come on to in later videos how we determine the price for goods in markets. But what this essentially says is, as you change the price of a good, the quantity demanded of that good falls or rises in reaction to that. So just a review of that. The law of demand explains why the demand curve is downward sloping. So downward sloping, you can see here the gradient of this curve is negative. And this is because as you increase the price, for example, if you decrease the price, quantity will move in the opposite direction. And as explained previously, in economics, there's this idea of effective demand, which factors in both the desire for goods and the ability to pay for them. So as I said previously, we'll be looking in later videos at how prices for goods are determined in markets. For those of you who may have a head start, you'll know that this is due to an interaction between demand and supply. We're not onto supply just yet though, so try and imagine that this curve isn't there, and let's just focus on this red curve, the red demand curve, and try and reinforce what we know from the previous slides, from the law of demand, to explain why the demand curve looks like this. So we know that the demand curve is downward sloping, that's shown here, and why is that? Well, let's assume that the price of this good goes up to some price P1, if we go across to the demand curve and go down, we can see that the quantity, so quantity demanded has gone down from Q star to Q1 as the price has gone up from P star to P1. And so this shows, it confirms what we've learned in the law of demand. The price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down, and if the price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. So hopefully that gives you a better idea of the law of demand and explains why the demand curve looks how it looks. So now we're going to be looking at determinants of demand. So determinants of demand are reasons why demand may change for a good or service apart from the price. And an easy acronym that I've used to remember this is ISCTAP. So ISCTAP. And this gives you 6 of the most common determinants of demand, those being incomes, substitutes, complements, taste and fashion, advertising, and population. And we'll be going through each of these in turn now. So let's start off with determinants of demand and incomes. So as we talked about before, about this idea of effective demand, it refers to the ability of people to pay for goods and services. And this is what we're talking about when we're graphing demand curves. And therefore, incomes have got a lot to do with whether you can afford to pay for goods and services. And therefore, if an individual's income goes up, he or she is able to afford more of a good or service than before. And therefore, that individual is going to be able to demand more of that good. And this works the other way as well. So if incomes go down, then demand for some goods and services may go down as well, because people just can't afford to continue buying those goods. So now we're going to go on to substitutes. So what are substitute goods? Well, they're goods that fulfill the same or similar needs of consumers, meaning that they can replace one another. Now, key example of this is Pepsi and Coca-Cola. They're very similar goods, the cold beverages, and therefore they fulfill basically the same needs of consumers. Consumers want a cold drink on a sunny day, well, they go to Pepsi and or they go to Coca-Cola. It doesn't really make a difference. And therefore they can replace one another. They're substitute goods. Now, if the price of good A, so if we say that goods A and B are substitute goods, if the price of good A goes down, then the demand for a substitute good B, decreases. So let me explain this further. So let's take the example of Pepsi and Coca-Cola. Let's say that the price of Pepsi goes down. So you're there at the shop, you see that the price of Pepsi has gone down, price of Coca-Cola has stayed the same. Because you're relatively indifferent between the two, you don't mind which one you choose, obviously you're going to purchase more Pepsi, and therefore you're going to purchase less Coca-Cola. And therefore the demand for the substitute good, good B, or Coca-Cola in our example, decreases. And again, this works the other way as well. If the price of good A goes up, so if the price of Pepsi goes up, you're going to buy less Pepsi, and you're going to buy more Coca-Cola, because that seems like a more attractive option. So now let's look at complements. So complement goods are goods that are used together and therefore consumed together by consumers. Now, key examples of this are pen and paper, fish and chips. Unlike substitute goods, it's not one or the other you're choosing. You're actually choosing both because one isn't as good without the other. And so you're choosing these together. They're consumed together. Now, let's say that goods C and D are complements. If the price of good C goes up, then the demand for a complement good D, decreases. Now, what do we mean by this? Well, let's use the example of fish and chips. If the price of fish goes up, then people are going to maybe not going to buy fish and chips more often because fish and chips in total cost a lot more. And therefore, even though it's only the price of fish that's going up, people buy less fish and chips, and therefore the demand for chips also decreases. And again, this works the other way as well. If the price of good C goes down, so let's say the price of fish goes down, then the whole meal, the whole fish and chip meal may go down in price. And so people might want to buy fish and chips more regularly. and therefore demand for chips goes up. Taste and fashion are also determinants of demand. So when we think about taste and fashion, it could be fashion trends or seasonal trends. For example, the demand for gloves tends to go up in winter, demand for ice cream tends to go up in summer. And so with these examples, we can see that the demand for different goods can change depending on what time of year it is. Taste and fashion can also change demand over long periods of time. And one of the good things I like about economics is that it's very easy to find links between the different parts of the syllabus. And one of these interesting things is the link between tastes and fashion, what we're covering now, and inflation. If you've seen my inflation video, you'll know that the basket of goods is part of the way the government calculates price levels. And therefore, the basket of goods is critical in allowing governments to know how prices in general in the economy have changed over time. Now, one of the important things to know about the basket of goods is that what's included in the basket changes from year to year depending on tastes and fashion. Because we don't want to know what price levels were 30 years ago, we want to know what price levels are now. And therefore, the basket of goods needs to take into account what consumers demand now and what major trends in consumption are affecting demand now. If you haven't come across the basket of goods yet, I highly recommend you see that inflation video. And what's more, I advise that you, as you increase your knowledge of economics, try and find these links between different ideas because it makes the subject that more enjoyable. Advertising is also an important determinant of demand because good advertising can make a product seem more attractive, making you desire it more, such that you're willing to pay for it or willing to pay more for it. A really good example of this is in Times Square here, where loads of brands are paying astronomical amounts of money to advertise. This is fairly obvious, but if you advertise your goods, if a company advertises their goods, then more people are going to know about it, more people are going to want to buy it, and therefore demand increases. Population, again, is fairly obvious determinant of demand because if usually as the population of a country increases, firstly, more people are able to buy, more people are there to buy goods and services. This increases the size of the consumer base, and therefore there's higher demand for goods, especially for staple goods such as bread, milk, etc. Because no matter who you are, you're going to need bread, you're going to need milk, and therefore demand for these goods is hugely affected by changes in population. So we've already seen in this video how changes in price, the price of a good, can affect quantity demanded through our downward sloping demand curve and simply shifting along this curve, moving up and down, depending on whether prices increase or decrease. But I'm sure you're wondering now how we can show the effects of the determinants of demand, our Iskatap factors, on demand itself. And the answer to this is that changes in demand caused by the Iskatap factors, determinants of demand, causes shifts in the demand curve. So let's say for some reason that demand increases because of one of these factors here, then we show that on the diagram through the outward shift in the demand curve from D0 to D2, as we've labeled here. Alternatively, if demand goes down for some reason, for example, if the population of a country goes down, then demand falls from D0 to D1, and that's an inward shift. Now, there's an important distinction to make between changes in price and showing that on a diagram, and changes in these other determinants and showing that on a diagram. As I've said already, changes in price cause movements along the demand curve. For example, from point A to point B, if the price goes up, then quantity demanded goes down. Sorry for being a little scruffy here. Well, and that causes a shift, not a shift, a movement along the demand curve. However, changes in any other determinants, as I've already said, cause these shifts. So here are some questions which will hopefully reinforce your knowledge of all the material we've covered. Feel free to pause the video. We'll be going through these questions now. Okay, so mass immigration into a country. How does this change the demand for bread? So mass immigration to this country, I'll just note our factors here because these might come in useful. So mass immigration is clearly changing the population. And mass immigration, well, this is going to lead to an increase in the population of the country. How does this change the demand for bread? Well, we know that bread is a staple good, and therefore more people are going to buy bread because there are more people in the country. So demand for bread will increase. The price of broccoli goes up. Ceteris paribus, what will happen to the demand for cauliflowers? Okay, so ceteris paribus, I'll just remind you, that means keeping all other variables equal, so we're just focusing on the price of broccoli and the demand for cauliflowers. So broccoli, cauliflowers, they're very similar vegetables, and therefore we can say that they are substitutes. Now the price of broccoli goes up. So imagine yourself in the grocery store. You see broccoli and cauliflower side by side. The price of broccoli goes up, so broccoli seems less attractive to buy. So you're going to buy more cauliflowers instead, and therefore demand for cauliflowers goes up. A wine company starts to advertise its products. What would likely happen to the demand for its wine? So this is a relatively simple one. This is advertising. And if the wine company starts to advertise its products, more people know about them, and therefore demand for their wine is going to increase as well. Now, the price of wristwatches increases. Ceteris paribus, which way will this shift the demand curve for wristwatches? So this is a trick question, because as I said in the previous slide, changes in price do not shift the demand curve for wristwatches, or for any good. Changes in price cause movement along the demand curve. They don't cause shifts. This is a really important one, so if you didn't get this one right, make sure you see the previous slide and make sure that's firmly in. This is a trick question. So here's a news article relating to the topic of demand in general. Cauliflowers dwindle in the UK as extreme weather takes its toll. So if you want to reinforce further your knowledge of this topic, try and answer these questions, even the extension. I have to admit the extension is quite hard, so if you need to research that one, then go ahead. Thank you very much for listening.